The creators at Critical Role and Darrington Press recently announced the open beta for their long-anticipated tabletop role-playing game, DAGGERHEART. This had been heralded as a potential direct competitor to Dungeons & Dragons, through which Critical Role has played multiple campaigns and what they're famous for, so a game of their own design is obviously something to be excited about. Now that it's available for playtesting, the similarities are undeniable, but loads of inspiration and influence from other sources have also been incorporated, and the end result is an experience that's unique all on its own. For those mainly familiar with D&D, let's break down how DAGGERHEART sets itself apart. The first and foremost main gimmick separating DAGGERHEART from D&D are the Duality Dice. D&D uses the famed D20 for most action rolls or dice checks in the game, whereas DAGGERHEART utilizes two D12s with an added Fate mechanic on top. One of the dice is labeled as the Hope die, and the other as Fear. You, the player, can distinguish between the two when rolling by using two different colors. In any roll, the combined number of the two dice will be compared against a difficulty set by the GM for pass or fail as normal, but whichever die rolled higher also allows the player or GM to acquire a new resource of Hope or Fear, respectively. Say you roll an 8 and a 5 on your Duality dice. The 8 is from the Hope die, and the 5 is from the Fear die. Because the Hope die rolled with a higher number, you, as the player, get to take one Hope. If the numbers were swapped, the GM would instead take one Fear. Players acquire Hope, whereas GMs acquire Fear. This currency of Hope and Fear become new liquid resources for both the players and GM to expend on some nifty narrative and mechanical effects. Depending on which die rolled higher can also affect the outcome of the roll as well. A pass with Hope, that being a pass of the check with a Hope die rolled higher, generally means a clear of the challenge with a good outcome. A pass with Fear, meaning your roll beat the difficulty of the challenge, but it was the Fear die that rolled higher, means you still clear the challenge, but some negative aspect could also affect you. The game is designed around this potential for opportunistic consequences as a way to mimic the unpredictable nature of fate mechanically. The famed natural 20, or critical success, isn't done away with just because there's no D20 die either. Instead, a critical success can be achieved by rolling doubles on the Duality dice, 2 8s, 2 6s, 2 3s, etc., etc. For advantage and disadvantage instances, simply add or subtract a d6 from the roll rather than re-rolling altogether. So, after the players and GM have accumulated Hope and Fear, what do they do with it? Hope can be spent to empower your rolls in certain circumstances, or enable you to perform some actions or abilities with an added modifier as if you had a small blessing. For example, if you're asked to do a negotiation check against some NPC, you could expend a Hope to potentially add a modifier to your roll if your background experiences would warrant it. More on experiences later. Hope can also be used to help allies or empower abilities in battle. Fear, on the other hand, provides the GM opportunities to throw obstacles to players through the narrative and take turns or empower foes in battle. Technically, the GM holds all the power in the game regardless, so they could theoretically do whatever they want either way. But the incorporation of Fear brings the player in on those consequences through the results of their own dice rolls, and can add a layer of validity to the GM direction when bad things seem to occur. Rather than just become another currency to track and hoard, Hope and Fear are integral to the core mechanics and should be applied readily throughout a session. Players and the GM can only hold a certain amount of Hope and Fear throughout the game, and overcapping is just a loss of those boons. So it's encouraged to be more liberal in their use, and readily, quote-unquote, do cool things with them, as the developers say. With that in mind, let's dissect the differences in combat and tactics between the two games. Positioning, for one, is less relevant in general. Opportunity attacks, for instance, have been done away with, and some traits and concepts are abstracted as opposed to strictly numerical. Take, for example, distance measurements. Rather than being defined in specific units, such as feet, DAGGERHEART uses terms like melee, close, very close, far, and very far. The manual offers rough estimations of these terms. Melee is touching, very close is 5 to 10 feet, etc. But spells and abilities default to using those abstract descriptions over the more precise range of 30 feet descriptors you might be used to. Hit points and armor are also very different in DAGGERHEART. For hit points, instead of having a numerical pool of anywhere from 8 to 200, you only need to keep track of about 5 to 10-ish. These are represented by individual blocks on your character sheet. Your armor is also broken down into different parts. There's an armor score, which is a number, and your armor slots, which are another set of individual blocks on your character sheet, which range from anywhere between 3 and 9-ish. What you traditionally think of as your armor class from D&D is referred to as your evasion in this game. It works like this. An enemy makes an attack at you by rolling a die. If the enemy's attack roll beats your evasion, then the attack hits, similar to how armor class works in D&D. When an enemy hits, it then rolls damage, and you will suffer that amount of damage. However, you can choose to expend armor slots to reduce that incoming damage or potentially nullify it altogether. Armor slot potency is determined by the armor score of your equipment. For example, leather armor provides an armor score of 3, whereas chainmail provides a score of 7. So if you were hit by an enemy and were wearing leather armor, instead of taking the full damage, you can choose to expend an armor slot and reduce that damage by 3, or 6 if you expend 2 armor slots, etc. If you had chainmail on, expending an armor slot would reduce the damage by 7. Obviously, if you wear heavier and sturdier armor, you should be able to reduce more damage, and this is reflected by the amount that can be mitigated through the equipment's armor score. This system adds nuance to armor condition. As the battle progresses and you take more hits, your armor will naturally get battered and become less effective, eventually rendering itself useless. The game mechanics reflect this happening as you tick off armor slots until you ultimately run out and you must take the full damage of incoming attacks instead. The next elephant in the room is hit points. Unlike in D&D, where raw damage numbers are pitted against raw HP numbers, Daggerheart utilizes thresholds to manage hit points and wounds. Here's how that works. Characters and enemies have damage ranges that are broken up into 3 categories, each separated by a threshold: minor damage, major damage, and severe damage. Any amount of damage taken that falls beneath the minor damage threshold does not actually reduce hit points. Instead, it adds stress to your character, another resource that I'll explain momentarily. If the damage taken exceeds your minor damage threshold, but not the major damage threshold, you lose 1 hit point, or 1 hit point block. Damage taken between the major damage threshold and severe damage threshold causes you to lose 2 hit point blocks. And high damage sustained that exceeds that severe damage threshold will net you 3 hit points lost. Keep in mind that you can choose to mitigate some damage taken by expending armor slots, so keeping your character battle ready becomes this neat game of balancing your hit points and armor slot resources. The switch from high pooled hit point calculations to threshold and blocks also should theoretically make it faster and easier to track damage effects on health. When your HP gets reduced to 0 and you have no more hit point blocks left, you, of course, die. But rather than simply dropping unconscious a la D&D and do death saving throws, you instead get to choose from 3 final options. 1. Go out in a blaze of glory, where you auto-succeed on a critical final move and then heroically perish. 2. Avoid death entirely and fall unconscious, but risk permanently hampering your character in the future with a scar that reduces the capacity of the hope resources you can have at one time. Or 3. Risk it all, whereby you take a chance on the roll of the Duality Dice to determine with a roughly 50-50 chance to either stay on your feet and continue fighting through gritted teeth, or immediately die on the spot. Each has its benefits and pitfalls, but having the options adds player agency to the end of their characters and has the potential to produce some truly epic cinematic scenes. Now, going back to that term I mentioned earlier, stress. Stress is a resource that your character accumulates under pressures that broadly correspond to any physical or mental strain, either narratively or through combat. Casting certain spells will require you to take on a point of stress, for example. Damage taken below the minor damage threshold causes stress. If you fail a check or get yourself in a traumatic situation, the GM can decide to inflict your character with stress. Managing this stress is important, as when you garner too much and there are no more blocks on your character sheet to fill, but you have to take on another point, you instead lose a hit point. This is supposed to represent the accumulation of that stress to manifest as a physical detriment to your character's health, which helps characterize those lesser moments of strain that your character undergoes while adventuring, which can build over time to become a true wound. As for how to reduce stress or replenish hit points and armor slots, all of those things can be done during long and short rests as usual. On top of all of that, the flow of combat is also very different from Dungeons & Dragons. There is no initiative. Players can act in any order and however often they would like when an encounter starts. And this may seem counterintuitive for structured gameplay, but the Duality Dice mechanic helps provide a framework by essentially separating combat into player and enemy phases. When the encounter opens in the player phase, player turns or actions are tracked using tokens. Anytime a player decides to take a turn, they put forth an action token to signify that they are performing an action. And these action tokens aren't game proprietary or anything like that. They could be anything like coins or buttons, just something to physically track when and who has done an action. They then roll the Duality Dice as normal for their attack or spell, etc. If they succeed and roll with hope, the player phase continues and another player can act after. However, if they miss or fail, or succeed but they rolled with fear, that it being the fear die is the higher number, the phase swaps and then the GM and enemies can take their actions. Here's what helps keep it all balanced too. Enemies can only act as many times as there are player action tokens put forth. Once those tokens have been expended, the phase swaps again back to the players. This makes combat more varied and dynamic, rather than a set initiative list that cycles in perpetuity. The turns can alternate each time from player to enemy to player to enemy if dice rolls are poor, but if the players are on a streak, they can strike again and again before the enemies even get a chance to act. As a consequence, however, when the phase does swap, the GM gets to also enact multiple enemy actions. There are of course ways for the GM to interject enemy actions into battle if need be as well. If the players are extra lucky for one encounter and roll with hope 10 times in a row, that would leave no opportunities for the enemies to act and the fight could get cheesed. To prevent this, at any time, the GM can expend fear to immediately force enemy turns. If the GM has no fear to expend, they can instead exchange the available action tokens for fear at a 2-to-1 ratio. This ensures that as players take their actions and tokens pile up, the GM won't be locked out and will have a chance to make a move as well. In addition to fear being used to interject enemy turns, fear can also be spent by the GM as a resource to clear detrimental conditions, give enemies advantage, or even enable special abilities. The manual includes many preset monsters and foes, and each stat block will state whether they have a fear-induced ability. This entire system is designed to make combat feel more fluid and alive. It encourages players to communicate and strategize when taking actions, as nobody is locked in a specific turn order. There are even rules for tag team attacks should players wish to combine their efforts in a single blow. You never know when fear might strike, so you might as well go all out and press an advantage when you've got the chance. Moving next to character creation comparisons between the two games. Obviously, D&D has got quite a legacy under its belt. There are numerous modules and expansions that can be referenced on top of the core player's handbook to introduce countless additional options, making nearly anything you can think of possible when it comes to character creation. On the other hand, despite still being a fledgling, DAGGERHEART also manages to distill much of the plethora of options into a nice menu, even with this first initial beta edition. Let's break it down. There are a whopping 18 races to choose from, described as your Ancestry. These include anything from humans, to tiefling-like daemons, to frog-like ribbits, and even mushroom people called fungril. Your Ancestry doesn't affect your stats, but each does come with a unique feature. Next, you choose your community, which is essentially the type of area and social structure from your upbringing. Highborn, Seaborn, and Wildborn are available as options, and they too come with unique features. Together, the Ancestry and community form your heritage, comparable mechanically to basically race and background from D&D, but arguably more streamlined. You also get to create experiences, as mentioned before, which are specific traits, jobs, or phrases that help define your character using information from their past. They can range from something like bodyguard or sharpshooter to quick hands or I'll catch you. When you create these experiences, they are assigned a modifier, +1, +2, etc., that can be invoked using your accumulated hope on a roll when you try to do something that calls back to that experience. You'll work closely with your GM on these, but they're intended as a tangible way for your past to feel like it matters in gameplay. Then we come to classes, and DAGGERHEART diverges from D&D quite a bit again. There are 9 base classes available in the playtest, those being Druid, Rogue, Warrior, Bard, Ranger, Sorcerer, and Wizard, which fulfill similar archetypes to their D&D counterparts, and the new Seraph and Guardian, which lean into cleric-y/paladin and tank roles. Despite sharing some names, the systems and progression behind classes are very different from D&D. Classes are made up from the union of two, what are called domains. There are 9 domains total: Arcana, Blade, Bone, Codex, Grace, Midnight, Sage, Splendor, and Valor. Each domain represents a core theme or gameplay fantasy, and in that way they are all unique. By blending the themes of 2 domains together, you arrive at the traditional class archetype. For example, the archetype of warrior is easily identifiable: battle-hardened and weapons specialist. In Daggerheart, the warrior class is comprised of the domains Blade and Bone, mastery of weapons and mastery of swiftness and tactics, respectively. Rogue is made from the Midnight and Grace domains, Wizard from the Codex and Splendor domains, and so on and so forth. The domains that your class belongs to allows you to access the features from those sets of domain cards. Yes. I should mention that Daggerheart utilizes a card system for organization of spells and features. Rather than choosing spells or feats at certain levels from a list, like in D&D, spells and features are bundled in easy-to-understand tiers of cards according to whatever domains you have access to. At level 1, you have access to tier 0, and you can choose a number of cards to fit into your loadout, which can then be used during play. As you level up, you can choose cards from higher tiers with more powerful spells and abilities, and hold more in your loadout up to a max of 5. Any additional cards that you acquire then get placed to the side as currently inactive in a vault, but you can expend resources in battle to switch them out with a card in your loadout or freely outside of combat. It may seem unfamiliar, but it's actually very intuitive and makes tracking your abilities as simple as looking to see what cards you have in front of you. It also adds a nifty spin on the prepared spells conundrum of D&D with the 5-card loadout maximum and card swapping between the vaults. Theoretically, this should reduce instances of new players getting decision paralysis while looking at a long list of spells to prepare or choose from in battle. By selecting domain cards, you effectively build out your class, and one warrior can look very different from another based on the cards that each player decides to take. And those are the basics. You can imagine that the class and domain system, as well as the mechanics from the Duality Dice, and HP and strain and armor resource management in combat would ultimately add up to a very different gameplay experience than your traditional Dungeons & Dragons session. Despite the 2 games leaning into the high fantasy genre, a D&D campaign versus a Daggerheart campaign can feel like 2 wildly different beasts. There are, of course, many other differences between the 2 not previously mentioned. Gold is abstracted in the same way as distance, with measurements being made in handfuls, bagfuls, and hordes as opposed to strict numbers. Damage types are simplified into just physical and magic damage. The 6 main traits or stats are slightly tweaked: presence versus charisma, instinct versus wisdom, etc. Daggerheart also has another gameplay mechanic called countdowns that handles certain timed occurrences, like the turns between a rechargeable enemy spell, or tracking the number of minion waves that strike before a catastrophic event. And so much more. The provided open beta manual is over 370 pages long, so obviously outlining every comparison would take too long to list. But overall, there seems to be enough substance here to warrant Daggerheart a shot at the big boy TTRPG table. Only time will tell whether it can stand on its own 2 feet following release in 2025, or if it gets trampled by other more established and upcoming names in the space. Thanks for watching. What do you think about the new Daggerheart game? And do you intend to try it out at your table? What parts do you like? What about it worries you? Definitely let me know in the comments down below. Until next time. See ya!